the Sephardim lived in courtyards like they had in Spain. So you had many little small 1 or 2 room apartments off the courtyards, and you had nuclear families. Or you had, let's say, when the son got married, he took the bride into his family. And of course, there was always issues with the mother-in-law. But as you know, in those days, everything was very Spartan. So the woman had to cook, and she had to clean, and she had to wash the clothes by hand. And in all of that came out a lot of tradition and folklore. And women did these chores together. And of course, say the mother-in-law would be very hard on the woman, for cooking, and usually the woman was very young, and it was a new environment in the husband's family, and you had multi generations. Usually had 3 or 4 generations living in the same courtyard, and then with other families. Amongst the crypto Jews, the woman, she related the tradition, and also in Sephardic tradition, also when they were open Jews, the woman also was a cardinal point for relaying and transmitting the tradition. The actual Sephardic communities had people that would check what was going on and control modesty. The Sephardic romances were preserved and developed in these courtyards, and the little kids obviously grew up in the courtyards also. Judeo-Spanish was transmitted as a spoken language. Little children, for example, were put to sleep with lullabies sung to them often by their grandmothers. This is how tradition was transferred. So it wasn't just you learned Judeo-Spanish romances and songs and cantigas, but you also learned biblical stories. And of course, this all was oral. So past generations, especially those that had lived as young adults or children up to World War II, recalled many of these traditions. And this is what we have in many of our folklore archives. During the third quarter of the 19th century, there was the entrance of French Jewish school systems and other school systems like Ezra in the region. There was also like the French Lycée Français. And then, as I told before, you had Scottish schools of Protestant missionaries and German schools, etc., etc. With the new schooling, there was upward mobility. Women also would become teachers. Okay? And they had professions, so they didn't stay home, but they also had careers. They also worked. Sometimes they would help their husbands, but there's a big change to the women, and then because of that, there was a change in the dress. Now, Sephardic women, in particular in Salonika, had a very particular dress. They had a headband called a kofia. There were various layers which covered up the cleavage and covered up the body and covered up the curves in the body. With time, all this was replaced by modern European dress. So women would wear just fashionable European dresses, and men would wear pants. They wouldn't wear robes anymore. They wouldn't wear jalabias. They wouldn't wear turbans. Men would wear now like the Turkish fez. But women left the courtyard culture. Many of the women worked in the tobacco industry, especially sorting tobacco. Those were the socialist secular women. They were very Sephardic. They spoke Judeo-Spanish, but they were very secular. So we can't just talk about one type of woman. Obviously, a bourgeois woman was much better dressed than a poor woman who might have looked like she was wearing disheveled rags sometimes. And that also gave way to a lot of immodesty. Then the Zionist movement also had women's sections. There were women's movements and youth movements for girls. So, for example, in the Alliance schools, it was separate originally between boys and girls. So only took a few decades for there to be integrated education. And then in the youth movements, everything was very integrated. In the Zionist youth movements, you had women who made Aliyah and were on Hachshara, agricultural settlement farms, and they didn't wear, they might have worn shorts and a khaki shirt, a work shirt. So the whole exposure of the woman to Western society changed, and the whole tradition changed. And of course, this was wiped out in the Holocaust, but for 2 or 3 generations prior to the Holocaust, the role of the woman had changed, and she became much more westernized and Europeanized. So before the Sephardic woman spoke Judeo-Spanish, she could barely read. They had Sephardic prayer books for women, but most women were not literate until about the 1870s. With the Holocaust, all this was eradicated. There were very few figures. There was one Judeo-Spanish author. She was a bachelorette in Salonika. Her name was Reina Cohen. She was very Kabbalistic, crazy. She was a nudnik to Rabbi Uziel, the chief rabbi. But as in terms of her literary talents, today we know about her, and she's probably the only woman who, in Greece, who was a Judeo-Spanish author. In Sarajevo, there was a woman, Bachoreta Papo. But these women were very rare. There was a woman named Versano who had her own girls' school, and she rode a horse, and she once caught a robber, and she actually had a pistol, and she pulled out the pistol, and she scared the robber away. Once someone was going to make a movie about her, but it never happened, so she's really unknown. There was a scholar named Rachel Dalvin who I quoted. She lived in America, but she lived in Preveza and was a Romaniot, and when she was 5, her family migrated to America. The family originally was from Yanina, and in America also she was unusual because she was educated. She got a doctorate. She did all this research. She was a playwright. She had a university position already in the 30s, but it was very rare for women to excel so much before World War II in secular society, whether they were Jewish or not. I talked a little bit before about Sephardic women making amulets and charms, but this was part of the past culture, and it continued until the Holocaust. Obviously, someone born in the 1910s, 1920s in Greece had a much more modern perspective and culture, but their parents and grandparents were, let's say, the old world, much more traditional Sephardic culture.